It's no surprise that the COVID pandemic continues to bring challenges and risks to all companies, small and large. We don't want to miss the biggest risk of all, data security and resilience. The big question we keep hearing and we need to ask ourselves is, where did our data go? And with all the changes that have occurred in our environments, considering the continuation of work from home and now return to office, data security and resilience is top of mind. Due to COVID requiring data to be spread to homes and laptops and mobile devices, these items become more of an issue if not known, and are the base of the issues that are arising today. The risk to an organization could increase if processes implemented to help secure systems protect data and information and maintain daily operations are not followed. How do we continue to support and ensure compliance over a changing data environment? Our people are moving data in and out of our environment all day long, every hour, every minute. What do we do? Welcome to our Go Beyond Disruption podcast, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of the AICPA and CIMA. My name is Ravi, and it's a pleasure to be your moderator today. I'm proud to be a partner and practice leader at EisnerAmper, a highly ranked national accounting and advisory firm. I specialize in providing process risk and technology solutions to companies of all sizes, and spent my entire career providing peace of mind around areas of risk and opportunities, whether it's adding value to internal audit and compliance, risk management practices, technology enablement, and even process transformation. This series gives you expert insights every week from inside the accounting and finance profession, perspectives that help you stay ahead of the curve, whatever business you're in, wherever you are in the world. This week's episode is the second in our special series of monthly Cybersecurity Advisory podcast. Today, we will guide you through the big question of, where did our data go? Again, I'm your moderator, Ravi from EisnerAmper, and I'm joined by Daimon Geopfert at RSM and Audrey Katcher at Ruben. Together, we will help you navigate the overall data risk landscape, including takeaways and views from a technical, compliance, internal controls, and regulatory standpoint. So let's meet our panel members, Daimon and Audrey. Audrey, thank you for joining today. Let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Audrey Katcher with Ruben, where we focus on helping our clients protect the data that they have with our advisory and independent control testing services.
Hi, everybody. My name is Daimon Geopfert. I'm a partner with RSM, where I head up the security and privacy practice nationally. My background stems heavily from the technical side of the house, with most of my life being spent in incident response, penetration testing, or security monitoring. And my role on today's call is going to be a little bit interesting. I'm here more to bring some war stories and a little spice to the stories.
Great. Thank you, Audrey and Daimon. So let's kick off with some of those storytelling exercises, because typically that resonates with the audience and members. Daimon, can you share some insights, as I know you've spent countless hours in that technical role that you mentioned, as well as incident response during the past few months?
Absolutely. And again, the point of the war stories, while they're there to educate and amuse, it's also to help frame the issue that we're talking through today. While we'll be talking through example incidents that we're working right now within clients, it does lay out the issue in a way where a lot of organizations have not thought through where they can be exposed in the area when it comes to managing their data. The first example I'm going to be used is going to be on the pure cloud side. Based on the COVID situation, similar to many organizations, we had a client that had to rapidly change their remote access procedures. In this case, it was very well controlled, very well thought of. The organization was very, very confident in their approach to the situation. The IT group was heavily involved, so was the audit and compliance and legal groups, and they were going through and going to assess a variety of cloud solutions that were going to be candidates for the organization to move over data processing and internal processing of a variety of types. So they went through and selected a variety of software as a service and platform as a service environments and facilitated internal working groups to review them and then stand up test beds in each of those environments, move over sampled business processes and data and give them a trial run to see if they'd be candidates for a long-term remote access solution. This worked really, really well, except for one or two minor points. First, they really did not understand the cloud solutions they were using, which led into two different main problems. The environments that were being built as test, obviously being viewed as low risk, had minor to none of the security controls properly deployed because what was supposed to be in those instances was going to be test data, junk data, not critical. On top of that is they did not understand that once they allowed some of their internal groups into those cloud instances, what they were going to be able to do. Because they were provisioned with administrative level privileges, those users that were there in the test instances were able to create sub-sites, create their own specialty instances, and actually start to move in production applications and data. So what this led to boil it down, is after the business selected 2 approved solutions, many of those test sites were orphaned, meaning the organization said, hey, we're not going to use those. They just cut off their access to them and moved on. The problem is while they did not deploy much security around them in the first place, they absolutely also did not bother to clean them up. And so they left versions of several of these cloud instances, some of them which had been loaded with production data, essentially orphaned on the internet until they were found by hackers. To compound the issue is while the organization had chosen 2 candidates and told the business to move over, not everybody in the business agreed. And so the users that have been testing several other instances that they liked better, because of their privileges, were able to create admin roles and move their business units into those unknown or unapproved cloud instances without much oversight and without the organization knowing. And so at the time that they'd been notified that several of their orphaned cloud instances had been located by hackers and breached, and they began their review, they started to find that several parts of the organization were operating out of these unapproved cloud instances, and in many cases had moved significant parts of production over to them in a way that violated many of their regulatory and legal requirements around the data that was involved. To add insult to injury is when the organization started to realize how out of control this had gotten, their first knee-jerk reaction was, through the corporate environment and their control of the employee endpoints, was they blocked all access to these known rogue cloud solutions. The users, in their infinite inventiveness, found out that if they moved the data to their personal cloud instances, such as Google Drive, they could then move it from there over to their now rogue cloud instances and get the data there. So the issue actually compounded, where the data that was already in these unapproved or orphan cloud instances was now starting to show up within the employee personal cloud instances. So again, what we're talking through there is just when organizations, even in their attempt to do the right thing, very, very quickly lost control of the grand scheme of what was going on in their organization. The second one that I'd like to use, and it's just a different twist off of this, but again, it represents several of the problems that can creep out of this when they're not properly controlled. We had another organization, again, flipping over to remote workforce with very, very short notice, having issues. They had already pre-deployed remote access solutions, did not realize that they did not play well with several of their platforms that had to be isolated and secured and segmented off from the rest of the environment. While they were trying to get the remote workers using those systems, what they did is actually take copies of those servers and move them out into cloud platforms. To continue on with the processing, what they did is they stood up a VPN from those services out in the cloud back into their corporate environment. Again, similar to the prior issue, they did not understand how to properly secure those cloud instances. On top of that is the servers they had moved into the cloud, which were at this point just virtual machines, just copies of prior physical servers. When they were in their own environment behind multiple layers of segmentation, their maintenance schedule was around patching about every 90 days, even for critical issues. Except now these systems were out and living in the cloud with much more exposure to the internet at large. The short version of this is attackers found these servers sitting in the cloud, unpatched, quickly compromised them, initially used them to send spam emails across the internet. After some exploration about a month later, found the VPN connecting back into the corporate environment, used that VPN to reach back into the corporate environment, gather data, used the VPN to move the data back out of the environment onto those virtual machines, and then export it out into foreign nations. So again, the grand scheme on this, when you boil down the two scenarios, is organizations trying to shift their environment around to manage the current situation. What they were losing was the control and concept of where their data was going and the connectivity between the different environments in play and that data.
Thanks, Daimon. It's actually amazing when we try to actually stay agile and adapt quickly in this environment, which we're learning a lot of lessons. And you use the words rapid and also shift quickly and then control. So the key takeaway here is just making sure you're not losing sight of those controls as well as the monitoring. And speaking of controls and going back to Audrey with that ounce of prevention, Audrey, any insight in following up on Daimon's comments? What are you seeing?
So in following up on his comments, one of the things we'll talk more about with the governance is that the training should have been there for the employees and the procedures should have been there for everybody to understand the risks that they were taking with moving this data into what we also affectionately call the shadow IT place. Sometimes moving into this shadow IT place is done inadvertently. We've enabled everybody with all of these great tools for video conferencing, etc. But did we tell them not to click that button on the right that says easily share this or save this in the cloud, record this in the cloud? We've got to educate everybody, not just those who are rolling out full infrastructure for technology, but could be recording confidential meetings and keeping confidential data out there in just with the simple things such as their video conferencing. We've also had this situation for many years with other entities that have been having data float out into the USBs, the local home computers for efficiencies, etc. So this is not necessarily a new situation. It's a situation that's been exponentially exposing us because of the quickness that we're having to put into place to help implement the technology to run our businesses at this time. A little bit later, we'll talk further more about the ounce of prevention that could have been put in ahead of this time and saved a lot of the pain and situations that occurred that Daimon got to deal with in some of his war stories.
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. That's great insight. And Daimon, thank you. It's good to hear those stories. You have a lot of them. So just following up, just from my perspective, if I put my regulatory compliance hat on, I know the regulators are really looking at this, in terms of how organizations are governing the environment in this so-called rapid changing environment. And as it's quickly changing, what are they doing? So many regulatory requirements are out there on data security, as we may already know, and they're in play, obviously, more now than ever, whether you're public or private. And my suggestion would be to ensure that you come back and review your overall risk and compliance framework. And as Audrey said, we'll probably touch on this a little bit more, to ensure that they're aligned, or when they're misaligned, how are you addressing that and taking the same tact as you're addressing those issues, those challenges from a regulatory standpoint as quickly as you did when you were implementing these new digital or cloud solutions. I mean, the regulators are going to be knocking at your door at some point, whether it's SOX compliance, GDPR, CCPA, or even HIPAA. Many other state and industry standards are out there for protecting data. It's just more critical that we adhere to what I would call the duty of care. So let's move on to another topic. We'll put this in the technical kind of cloud app view as we were talking about this, as we were preparing for the episode. So Daimon, let's start with you. I mean, what types of data are there? We talk about categories of data, et cetera, and how should it be managed? And what about those cloud platforms? And you spoke about that obviously in your story. And how do we go about finding, what's out there? And the issue is, if it's in the cloud, what do we need to be thinking about?
Data movement, tracking, understanding it, classification of it, finding it has been a long-running traditional problem. And what's interesting about this is, while it's gathering a lot of attention in the current scenario, this is just the typical growth off of a standard problem that's existed for quite a while. It's just we've added another layer of complexity to it. So many organizations have struggled for quite a while trying to track data, identify it, where did it go, where does it reside, who touched it, what type of privileges those people have. There have been a lot of products created and brought to market over the last 15 years that were put in place to solve those problems and did a reasonably good job of doing so. A simple example, DLP, data loss prevention. They're tools that run either at the endpoint, so on individual systems, or at the network layer, or both. That what they try to do is find different categories of data and then tell you what's happening to them, where are they going. So they can tell you, so as an example, endpoint DLP can tell you, you've told me to look for any files that have social security numbers or credit card numbers in them. You've told me to alert or block if someone tries to attach them to an email, upload them to a cloud instance, add them to a zip file, whatever it might be. And those have worked really well. The network layer examples will try to find those same files and block them from moving from one part of the network to another that it shouldn't, or going outbound. E-discovery tools traditionally have existed. They have many of the same aspects to them. They quite often get used in large file repositories, network shares, email. Anything along those lines that's worked in-house will work in the larger organizations that we're working in now, in the larger solution, the larger footprint that starts to include cloud. One part that is getting revisited is more of a brute force approach, but it tends to work pretty well, which is data flow and process mapping. So instead of trying to find every single data element that might meet some type of sensitive classification, what you would do is simply go in and say, hey, we know this business process or this business unit touches data of this type. They operate in this environment. They send materials in this way. Knowing that that data is included in the general flow of that traffic, you would simply define the controls to follow it all the way through that piece of the network. So that can be expanded out fairly easy out to cloud solutions, where you're talking to your remote users and saying, hey, we know you're a member of HR, you're in accounts payable, you're in the legal group. You guys typically interact with this type of data. Is the data on your local systems? Is it a network share, cloud share, whatever it might be, and then flowing through. More of a more tactical approach. In some organizations, they've actually gone to the point where anytime a document is produced by specific individuals or groups, they have no control over it. It's transparent. It's behind the scenes, but there's a data tag or watermarking burned into the files that are easy to identify by stuff like DLP. So all of these approaches, they worked really, really well for local systems and in the corporate environment, and they can be extended to cover cloud as well. The problem that you're running into is, in some of these, you sort of have to trust users to answer honestly or know what they're talking about. In some cases, they don't understand what's going on underneath the hood for some of their technology. And so the ubiquitous ease of use of cloud solutions means that some of these work, some of them don't. And what you're starting to see is purpose-built technologies for this. You're starting to see terms such as CSB, cloud security brokers. In all seriousness, it's a twist off of DLP, where what they are is dedicated tools and platforms that monitor your environments and your endpoints for the top 200, 300 most common cloud platforms. They identify any access to those. You can monitor, you can alert, you can block, you can allow it to certain sites, you can disallow it to certain sites. And what they tend to do is they'll alert you on files or data, certain types being uploaded to these cloud instances. And they also produce reports, which are usually a phenomenal source of intelligence. They'll identify this system or this specific user has uploaded X amount of data to these different data stores. Where what that allows you to do is, if you see users that are uploading, a couple hundred meg here, a gigabyte there to well-known cloud solutions, it might not be of interest. But if all of a sudden there's one person that just moved 500 gigabytes of data to a random cloud solution that you don't have a business relationship with, obviously there might be all sorts of weirdness that can come out of that. That could be an unapproved business process, a rogue cloud solution. It could be a user that's about to quit, and they're in the middle of an intellectual property theft. So any of those new solutions are getting heavy use right now in many organizations that are flipping out to these new remote access models. The part here they'll end with is make sure you fix it when you find it. We have a lot of organizations that go through and are identifying that they've got data flows going to odd places, and they've never really considered what they're going to do about it, how they're going to block it, how they're going to investigate it. And so it's ended up in some weird situations where they told somebody, hey, stop doing that, and then they didn't. Or they did stop doing it, but they never went back and cleaned up the instance. All that data that got moved out to that unapproved cloud share is still sitting there. So when you find it, have a formalized process to shut it down, remove it, investigate and find out if anything happened that needs to be reported. Did data get moved somewhere where the controls did not follow it, and now you might be in some type of regulatory issue? It is much, much better right now to self-report than let somebody else find it and blow the lid for you. We've had organizations that during their own investigations know that they were using some unapproved cloud solutions. Hackers were nice enough to find it, and the organization gambling decided not to mention it, but then the hackers released the data and now they're exposed. So make sure that you're finding the stuff, contact who you need to contact, notify them that you've identified it, what your plan of actions are to fix it. And then make sure you're centralizing the response and it's being tracked through somebody like legal or compliance, to make sure that it doesn't repeat.
And you're talking a lot about the detection side of things, and I know that's the world you live in. So in some cases, obviously, we want to go back to even the prevention methods, and we'll talk to Audrey. And Audrey, I'll ask you to kind of comment going back to, using that ounce of prevention.
So to pull it all together, what Damien's covering, he's covering some very important aspects of the tools and the how to find it and contain it. But I'd like you to jot down 7 steps. 7 steps to wrap this together. 7 steps for an ounce of prevention in the future. So I'll run through those. 1, we're going to define the confidentiality levels. 2, and we're going to find it, like Daimon covered. We're going to contain it, like he covered. 4, we're going to monitor it. 5, we're going to recover it. 6, we're going to ensure it. And 7, we're going to commit to it and commit our vendors to it. So let me drill down on a couple of those. For the first one, defining the data confidentiality levels. And it could be confidentiality for business data or privacy for personal data. We need to understand what needs protected at what level and have that definition in place to get started with our processes. Using our industry, accounting as an example, the highest level of security should be applied to things such as the social security numbers, the tax information, credit card information, and passwords. Your industry, your organization may have some of the same highest criticality items, and they may have more that are going to have regulatory implications that Jerry will cover. Then you move into 2 and 3 for finding and containing it, and making sure we've got that process and procedure in place and communicated to not be spinning up the shadow IT that Daimon has covered. Then we get into the area of monitoring. Monitoring on and having the controls in place to keep this environment that we think we've defined for confidentiality and data protection, making sure that that's going to be protected throughout a period and throughout the years. Some key basic items to cover in this area would be with the encryption, making sure we have that in place as a preventative control, awareness training. People are often our weakest link. We heard earlier about people trying to do great things and keep things up and running. They really meant well. But had they had the right security training, awareness training, had they committed to policies and procedures saying they wouldn't do these things with corporate data, we might be in better shape today and they'd be spending less time in some of these investigations. And a third area with the device security, making sure we understand what devices are accessing our confidential data and making sure that the devices are secured as well. In the 5th area with recovering it, we've put all this together, right? We've defined our data, we've found it, we're containing it. How are we going to recover it? So let's do a tabletop exercise before it hits the press. Before we have to do an incident disclosure. So do that tabletop exercise to recover the data in the different scenarios. Number 6, ensure it. That doesn't protect you from certain risks, such as a reputation risk if it is publicly known, but ensuring it is a good business practice. And 7, commit to it. And committing your organization to this data protection as well as your vendors, and we'll talk more about that in our next topic. But for now, maybe Jerry, a little more input on the regulatory aspects of this and ERM.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and those are great insights. I love how you broke it down into the 7 areas. Certainly this concept of our points of focus and overall enterprise risk and business resilience And again, how that all comes back to regulatory. So all of these areas just need to be aligned together. And, the organizations that I'm working with, and I know a number of others are working with, in terms of enterprise risk management, even if it's not formal, you're already having this concept of you're meeting and talking about certain risk areas. And I'll even go back to opportunities to improve. We're doing that more than ever today. We're meeting daily and certainly meeting weekly, whereas before we may have actually met on enterprise risk quarterly, maybe even annually. So the concept of duty of care is there, and certainly the regulatory requirements are only going to be more stringent. Even if you take things like GDPR or CCPA, where we need to be monitoring, and even going back to what Daimon had mentioned about detecting certain things and using the concept of these 7 areas that Audrey mentioned, I think mostly I see a lot of companies falling down in the monitoring. They're just not monitoring everything that they need to be monitoring, and they find out too late. So we have to make sure that we're aligning anything that's changing to those key risks, and we make that agile. Again, just as agile, and as we're adapting to digital solutions and spinning those up very quickly, we need to do the same with our controls and policies. We'd always come back to policies and making sure they align, and that's fine. But ultimately, we have to do it make a concerted effort to do it in a timely manner and not wait too long. So going back to even data security commitments that Audrey had mentioned, I think that's a key concept for us to cover in this conversation. So Audrey, I wanted to start with you in terms of navigating through all of that and going through what you agreed to. You mentioned SLAs and working with our vendors and what they can potentially commit to you, but ultimately we have committed to others. And there's legal requirements and agreements in place there. So, and again, going back to regulatory requirements, there's regulatory requirements that need to be discussed and adhered to. So how do you take inventory of all of that, and what are you seeing in organizations do in that respect? And what are your thoughts there?
What we're seeing, entities are taking an intertwined process to understand the commitments in 3 areas, and the 4th being regulatory. But the 3 main areas: what did we commit to in our contracts? What do we need vendors to commit to us to meet our commitments? Gotta love how that goes. And then number 3, the commitment from our people. So we've contracted to be secure in this area for this data. And we have a vendor we rely on for it, so he needs to be secure. And then, oh, by the way, we need to tell the body of people that could be spinning up shadow IT or cloud environments that they need to be committed. Buried in all of that, depending on the industry you're in, will be the regulatory concerns that Jerry speaks of. So the first one I'll hit: obtain commitment from your people. We need to communicate to them what data is needing to be more secure because of its confidentiality or privacy concerns. So we need to explain to them what is most important. We need to explain to them where they're allowed to store it. And we need to make sure that they're responsible and accountable for reporting to us as an organization of any breaches or accidental recording in the cloud and things like that. Number 2, we already committed to this. So many entities have so many personnel, sales guys, whatever you want to call them, depending on the business, that are committing to security and confidentiality and data privacy items in the contracts. So with your leadership of operations, understanding what you're committing to and how you're going to track that. You need to track it for 2 reasons. 1, is it right to legally commit to it? But 2, now that we've committed to it, do we have a tracking to know who we've committed what to? So in Damien's war stories, did we know who we made commitments to that we had to explain and disclose incidents to? And then the 3rd area with the vendors committing to us. We have dependencies, and there could be vendors, business partners, subservice organizations. We have entities that we're dependent on to meet our security and confidentiality and privacy commitments over this data. So we should be looking at their independent reports for controls. For example, we're all aware of a SOC 2 with a focus on security. We should also look for that report to have a focus on confidentiality, which will have controls for various types of sensitive information. And it will have reporting on independent reporting and control testing on the reporting of compromised security events and breaches. Or the SOC 2 may also have privacy, which is going to have more of a focus on the personal information and the life cycle of that information being protected from notice all the way to enforcement. In the fourth area, and I'll roll this back to Jerry with regulatory considerations, what are we doing commitment-wise with those regulators, and what should we do with that? Jerry?
Yeah, so that's another interesting topic with the regulators, and also talking about how they ultimately are affected, and if you are affected by it, then what are your commitments to communicate to them? Damien even mentioned that earlier in terms of finding out later on that actually the hackers ended up disclosing it, and then ultimately the regulators are coming in and saying to the companies, why didn't you disclose this to us first? So we have to be, again, I'll go back to the concept of duty of care and being agile. We have to make sure we're considering all of that. And we're doing that in the context of our commitments, as Audrey had mentioned, even including what we committed to and what the regulators expect. So ultimately, think about an example like health insurers. Many health insurers and healthcare providers are, spinning up instances of telemedicine. Right? So what are their controls behind all of that? They still have to align the controls around telemedicine within their HIPAA environments and HIPAA regulations and high trust, et cetera. Are they doing that? Have they done it? Who's actually helping them do that? And that's really the key, because what you're also finding out now are there are many organizations that have resource constraints. We're all working harder and longer hours because we're working from home. The days get blurred. But ultimately, are we spending the right amount of time in key areas of risk? And I'm finding many organizations are not doing that. They're starting to talk about it more these days, now that we're in week 17, 18, depending on where you are. But ultimately, we have to find a stakeholder that actually can take ownership of this. And it could be even a number of people. So going back to enterprise risk management, which in some ways has responsibility over with the enterprise risk management approach, but also the framework and also compliance, working as an organization to try to figure out if we need to tweak it at all and where we do that. And then communicate that back out, to Audrey's point, to the community of people that we have that are touching some sensitive areas. So in that healthcare example, who actually has access to the telemedicine applications? Even the consumers, the actual customer, the provider, how they're interacting, how they get that information. Is it secure? Now, ultimately, you're probably working with a vendor if you're in that business. Going back to what Audrey mentioned, are they complying with their commitments around whether it be a SOC 2 or something else? Have you asked all the right questions? So taking a hard look at that is very important. Damien, any follow-up in terms of your war stories, in terms of even the data classification and maybe even the regulatory side?
You two have covered this very well and very in depth. I again, using a war story to try and show how bad this can get in the scope of it. It's just very, very common while we're in the incident response mode and investigative mode that one of the common issues we run into within clients is they just have too simple of a data classification program. It basically boils down to, is it regulatory or not? At best they have, 3, they might throw confidential in there. It's still not granular enough. And the biggest thing is the controls don't follow it. And they just simply don't understand the repercussions of some of the data that they're handling and what it can mean to them. So the example I will use is a higher education institution we were working with, and they had a medical school there, very prestigious, and it was a great relationship they had with the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industries were always looking for new drugs to bring to market. The medical school was always looking for new research projects to help produce PhDs, and then the school was always looking for funding to support that research. So the pharmaceutical companies were cutting huge grants to the school to fund research, The candidates would go through and do research, develop new drugs. They would get to go through, push through their thesis, defend it, get their PhD. And then the intellectual property rights to the research then went to the pharmaceutical companies for them to develop new drugs and bring it to market. It was a very nice, virtuous cycle. The problem is, in the contracts, it essentially said if that intellectual property was ever exposed, the grants would have to be repaid. Within this higher education institution, they had a very, very simplistic classification process. Primarily said if it's social security numbers or personal data, they had one classification system. If it was anything not that, it really was treated as uncontrolled data, very liberally managed within the environment. So a lot of their research data and other materials was leaked online. It was found by one of the pharmaceutical companies who followed through and forced the institution to return tens of millions of dollars in grants that they had received over the last few years. The organization was completely blindsided. They had never considered that angle to the risk of the data. They never classified it properly, which led to no controls and no monitoring, which eventually led to a very big check being written.
And great points, Daimon. Thank you for that. And you know, I know when we were talking through a lot of this and even getting back to that regulatory pain point, and you spend a decent amount of time in the digital forensics side, you had mentioned something that resonated with me where it's the two categories, immediate hurt versus slow to come. Any insight on that as you're putting your forensic hat on or digital forensic hat on?
It's a very interesting situation. Everybody's always afraid of the more immediate pain. So the organizations that we're working with right now on more of the proactive security side, so more of our security transformation services where we're hardening their environment, deploying new tools, new processes to try to manage this, typically the risk that they're worried about is some type of security incident, a data breach, someone got data, got it out, somebody got ransomware into the environment, and all of that completely makes sense. That's immediate pain. The delayed effect is what we're seeing now. So many organizations that were in that first wave flipping over to remote work, they survived, or in so many cases had moderate incidents, got through, and they essentially kind of fell into this relaxed mode of we think we survived, anything from the hacking perspective. The problem is they missed the slow burning fuse that was the regulatory and legal issues that are going to come with their decision. So this goes back to the comments earlier of them not understanding the type of data they have, where it's going in some of the changes that were made for the remote workforce, where that data is now traversing and being stored and being processed, that the controls didn't follow that data. So a simple example here, we have an organization that is handling a very, very specific type of data for the federal government. There are extremely prescriptive controls around the types of security that must follow that data. When they flipped to the remote workforce, some of the solutions they put in place to allow them to keep working did not have those controls in place. They had taken out of a segmented environment, put in areas with more access than should have been allowed. They've realized this after the fact. They have to attest every year to the federal government that they met the requirements for managing this data. So imagine the situation. I'm sure this is not rare amongst the audience for this podcast. They haven't been breached. There's no reportable incident. They found the data. They can get it back under control, but they have to sign an attestation saying that they know they didn't manage it correctly and they know they're going to get fined for it. So you can guess the debates that are going on with that organization of what do we do with this? Do we play chicken, not report, and hope nobody notices? But while it was there, what happens if something did happen? What if the data got out and it comes out later and they know that we knew about it but didn't report? So it's led to some very complex business, legal, and risk conversations in several of our clients because they were so focused on the immediate pain that they missed this long delayed but probably much more damaging pain coming down the path.
Let's now go to some closing remarks and just go through one takeaway for each of us based on the stories and some of the guidance that we were given. Audrey, let's start with you.
So the three takeaways I have relate to having a focus in this area on the people. They're the first line of defense. They're the weakest link. So focus on the people and the communication and the commitment with them. Number 2 is the planning. And number 3 is preventing this, not dealing with it after the incident. An ounce of prevention with some governance and some controls, independent testing or advisory work on putting all this in place that ounce of prevention will cost you a lot less than the recovery that will have to happen when the incident does occur, and the potential exposure that could happen with an incident. So that ounce of prevention with the control testing and comfort there can go a long way.
Great point. Damien, your takeaway?
My takeaway is that Audrey cheated by taking the first answer and the easy one, because the answer is always the people. Because she took the always right answer, I'm going to go with something that's just a twist off of that. Is the risk is still going to be the people, but you can leverage technology to reduce the likelihood that they can really hurt themselves. Essentially, reduce the surface area in which somebody can make a mistake. So look at solutions such as DLP, the cloud security brokers, your endpoint monitoring, whatever it's going to be. There's always an availability of tools, if you use them right, that at least can give you some monitoring, some oversight, and some intelligence, where your people are trying to create new ways to work. They're trying to be flexible. They're trying to keep the lights on in the business. But if you're looking at some of these reports and you're seeing that odd amounts of data are going to unknown places that they shouldn't, start asking questions. Tell people they can't do that. Leverage those tools to back up that human element. If you just go and ask a bunch of your employees, hey, are you doing anything wrong? I would bet you any amount of money, they're probably going to say no. If you show up and saying, hey, listen, we're noticing this weird data, explain to me why. So don't ask them the binary yes or no question. Essentially say, I see this, explain it to me. You're much more likely to get to an answer. You're much more likely then to be able to pivot from there and say, okay, I understand why you're doing this, but you can't do it that way. Stop, switch, do it this way. So the people are always the problem, but technology at least can reduce the playground in which that they can fall down and hurt
Thank
themselves.
you, Audrey and Damien, for that. And I will add that, ultimately, bringing it all together, people, process, and put controls in that process bucket, as well as technology, is only going to enhance it. And my takeaway is just ensuring along the way, as you're looking at regulatory requirements and compliance, bring that in as you're adopting these new technologies, adopting these new processes. We're finding that a lot of companies are using this as an opportunity to manage risk better, measure it better, and also monitor it better. So let's improve what we're doing. And we're seeing a lot of that happening now as we're now in that 17th, 18th, again, week of this COVID pandemic. So, and also review your updated policies, ensure you have compliance with those requirements on the regulatory side. So in closing, a big thank you to you, the audience, for listening in. We really appreciate that. And to also our panel members. I'm honored to be a part of this podcast with you. So thank you, Daimon Geopfert at RSM and Audrey Katcher at Ruben Brown. Big thank you to you and your organizations for allowing you to be a part of this. So that's it for now. If you want to explore this further, you can just have a look at the show notes for this episode. They contain links to resources that can help you navigate the data security landscape. To view those notes, just click on this episode's info icon in the podcast app on your smartphone or tablet, or open the episode in your computer's web browser. You'll find everything right there. Or just go to gobeyonddisruption.com for all of the back episodes and more resources. From EisnerAmper, I'm Ravi. We'll be back soon with some conversations that'll help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Till then, be safe, thank you, and goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.